Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. On this episode of Blazor Train, I talk to none other than Steve Sanderson and David Fowler from the Microsoft ASP.NET team. As I mentioned in episode 1, Steve started the whole Blazor juggernaut in 2017 when he demonstrated C# running on WebAssembly in a browser at NDC, the Norwegian Developers Conference in Oslo. David, who along with Damian Edwards brought forth SignalR, was in the audience that day. We'll get David's reaction and talk to them both about the evolution of Blazor. That's all coming up right here, right now, on Blazor Train. Blazor Train! Steve and David, thank you for joining me on Blazor Train this morning. Let me start with a question for you, Steve. When did you first notice WebAssembly was a thing? And when did it occur to you that you might be able to get C# running on it?
Well, my first sort of interactions with this whole space were in 2015, I think. I was doing a conference talk called Web Development in 2020. And the premise was I was trying to predict what kind of technologies I thought would have changed the way we do web development by that time. You can still find that talk online if you want to. I went through a whole bunch of different things that I was predicting. And one of them was WebAssembly. And so I was trying to demonstrate that by compiling various different languages to WebAssembly. And I think I tried Go and Swift. I tried C#. I tried C and C++. And at that time, the only thing that I could make work was C and C++. Just everything else had so many problems, I just couldn't get it to work. But I really wanted to make .NET run inside the browser. I just couldn't. So I gave up on that for a while. And then a couple of years later, I was at another conference. This was in Poland. It was Rock Sharp. This was in March 2017. And I had a conversation just in between sessions with one of the other speakers, Chris Klug. And we were talking about like WebAssembly. And something about that conversation just absolutely convinced me that like, we can do it now. Now is the time. Like the technologies have all moved on. All the problems will have gone. I can do it. And I remember saying this to Chris, and he was just like, whatever. And he just didn't care at all. But I was really excited about it. So I went and started experimenting with trying to compile different .NET runtimes to WebAssembly. And I couldn't really make it work. But then I randomly came across a mention of another .NET runtime that I'd never heard of before called .NET Anywhere or DNA, which was written by one person called Chris Bacon, who's a really good person. And when I found the source code for that, it was just like a bunch of C files. It was so simple. And so that evening I had a go at compiling it to WebAssembly, and I was pretty amazed that it just worked first time. I loaded up
And it was like 6 years old, wasn't it?
Yeah, it had been abandoned for a long time by that stage. Yeah. Chris had gone to work at Google, and I guess he wasn't doing that stuff by then. But yeah, and I got this Hello World app, compiled it, loaded it into this WebAssembly runtime, and it just worked first time. And it was pretty astonishing to me that could actually work. So I just thought, well, I guess now we need a UI framework, and went on from there.
Right. So did you or the team ever consider compiling C# directly to WASM rather than using a CLR?
Yeah, well, in a sense, that was the first thing that I considered before I even got DNA to work. That's kind of the most obvious thing to do, but it's very much more difficult. And it's something we've considered many, many times since then. And this whole area of ahead of time AOT compilation is still one of the big features that we want to bring into a future version of Blazor, but it's a much harder problem to solve.
So that prototype, that talk that you did at Oslo in 2017 is really when the big world saw what you were doing. Did you show that prototype to anyone at Microsoft or any of your friends before you did that talk?
I don't think I did, but it was only about a month, remember, between when I decided that I was going to do that and when the actual event happened. So there wasn't much kind of opportunity or reason, and it was just like an evening's experiment thing. I think I had mentioned to my manager, Elon, that I was experimenting with it, but there wasn't really much of a reason to. Like,
David, you're shaking your head like you were in the audience, right? I mean,
it's funny because Damien and I had given a talk just before Steve's talk, and we were showing ASP.NET Core Futures. And I recall kind of rambling for a bit and showing the very last thing that I showed was basically Razor in TypeScript. And I had made that up like during the conference. I was like, okay, let me throw some stuff in there that's kind of random. So I started showing Razor in like, I think I called it, what I called it, TS-HTML. And I was like, okay, this could be a thing. This could be our path to having a client-side framework. And then Steve, I showed him afterwards, and then he goes, just wait. And I'm like, what could he have? Like, what could it be? And I sit in the audience, and I'm looking at Damien like, when did he do this? Like, this is insane. And I take my current my current thing, and I just throw it in the garbage because I know this thing's gonna be amazing.
It's like kind of like practicing the guitar and then going to see Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, exactly. It was fully working. I mean, the demo looked as though he had it all working. So I was just kind of like, okay, he compiled .NET, I made a framework, I ran it and wasn't in the browser. Like, how is that possible? It was kind of a shock, a good shock.
Right. I mean, I think the phrase or the action that comes to mind is this, right?
Mind blown. Yeah. And then after the talk, we sit down and Steve is like in his calm tone trying to describe how he like in a weekend took this random thing from GitHub and made a new framework and then combined those two things to have this model. And I was just like sitting there nodding, but in my head going, oh my gosh, he's a genius. This is insane.
Super genius. Steve, I know that makes you uncomfortable for people to talk so highly about you while you're sitting right here, but did you already conceptualize? Yeah. Did you already at that point conceptualize the component model and, you know, where this could take the whole industry and where it's gone now? I mean, were you actually thinking ahead that far at that point?
Well, yeah, because I have a background in doing UI stuff and particularly client-side web UI. That's kind of history. I've been doing that for a long time. I spent a long time building the Knockout.js framework, and all that was sort of heading into this world of component-oriented programming. So it wasn't really a very like a spark of like insight or whatever to do that. It was just following on from the obvious direction of the industry. It was a very natural thing to do. Yeah.
So how did the whole Blazor server idea come to fruition? And I got to think maybe, David, you might have had something to do with that, the SignalR team, because that's the sort of the magic that makes Blazor server work. Yeah,
so what had happened was Blazor wasn't done yet, right? In the very beginning, it was very slow and nascent, and Mono wasn't all the way there yet. So we were trying to find ways to have this rich component model still work in a web application. And it turns out I had seen Steve do a couple of demos with running Blazor, not Wasm, but Blazor itself, separating the rendering from the actual backend diffing of the UI. He had run it in a web worker. So the web worker has a background thread that isn't the rendering thread. And I had seen that. And then me and Javier, a different developer on the team, were talking about, could we have that model spread across server and client? Because turns out Steve had designed Blazor to actually support this model from the get-go, where you can have either rendering in place on the UI thread or rendering somewhere else, right? So he had shown Electron, he had shown web workers, and it seemed natural to pull the split across client and server. And then we thought, okay, SignalR is a pretty good tech for doing that. So could we actually plumb SignalR as the transport between the rendering and the diffing? And then that is history. We asked Steve if it could work, and Steve naturally went, oh, sure.
Yeah.
And then the rest is history.
So do you think the nature of WebAssembly and how it uses messaging to communicate with JavaScript makes that whole interaction a bit easier? I mean, it's already, WebAssembly is already separated from the UI in that way. Do you think that the whole architecture of WebAssembly just sort of naturally made that split possible?
Yeah, or the fact that we're doing .NET and not JavaScript means that you've forced to have some kind of decoupling there between the browser APIs and your application logic. You can't just like mix them all together because they're two completely different languages. So given that you've got that split anyway, that naturally gives you some seam that you can use to separate things out.
Yep.
And so what was the initial reaction to the Blazor server. I mean, when we talk to you guys on .NET Rocks, Steve, when we talk to you at least, and you were talking about, you were really focused on WebAssembly, and then we started talking. I think it was Jeff Fritz maybe, who said, no, now we have Blazor server, and it was just hard to wrap your mind around because so many people equated Blazor with WebAssembly that now we have this, oh, you really got to think of the component model, and now we have these two hosting models.
Yeah.
I mean, was that a hard message to drive home?
I think people have been confused about that, and even we were internally confused about that. We changed the names of them like multiple times. And so, it's taken a while before people have kind of internalized the idea that the component model is not the same as the runtime. But it might get easier in the future because it's likely that we won't be stuck with just two hosting models forever. We may have other hosting models too. By the time you get a third and a fourth way of running your Blazor components, you'll stop thinking of it as being, oh, it's a WebAssembly thing. And you'll just think of all the different ways you can run your components.
Yeah, I think the thing that made it sound, that made it gel for me specifically was when Steve showed it running in Electron. I went, okay, this thing actually is .NET Core running on your device. And there is a browser, but that's in the actual rendering part. But the actual component is running in .NET Core itself. There's no WASM here at all. And I kind of went, okay, this actually makes sense as a model in general.
Yeah. And you also did a great thing with Web Window, Steve, and showed a blog post about that and how you can take all the goodness of Electron and squeeze it down into something really small and really elegant. And again, mind blown. What's the what's the current state of Web Window, and how's it going to fit into the big picture of Blazor?
When Web Window, I think we would ideally like to consider as like a separate concept from Blazor, because if we think that the goal is to be able to do web-based UI from a .NET application, then Blazor is just one of the possible ways you could do that. And presumably we could make that work really well, but also you could use a different web-based UI mechanism. So it's kind of a separate thing. But in terms of where that is and where that's going, I think there's the best future for that kind of technology would be integrated into something bigger. It's not enough just to have a way of doing web-based UI. There'll be times where you need to do native UI rendering as well. Even if you just want to have things like OS drop-down menus at the top of your application, you can't just do that with the web. So probably some kind of more hybridized model that gives you both web-based rendering and native UI rendering in a single technology is likely to be the way forwards for that. So Web Window is a great prototype and has got people thinking, but I think the future needs like a bigger technology background than just that one thing.
Like Maui, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's our product on the roadmap for .NET 5 and 6 that does give a mechanism for combining native and web-based rendering. And we are certainly looking at integrating Blazor as one of the programming models there.
That's so cool. Do you guys feel like I do, that this is just like, it feels like Visual Basic 1.0 time, like the whole world has just opened up. I don't mean that particular, but I remember how I felt when I saw Visual Basic and how hard it was to write Windows apps before that. And it's that's sort of the same feeling I'm getting right now, is that you just simplified so many things about web development with the Blazor component model, and then all the stuff that you guys are doing, the tech on the back end. It's just amazing.
So it's funny, some history. When Steve joined the ASP.NET team again in his second stint after working on the Azure portal, he was working on the SPA framework, so like integrating React and Vue and Angular into ASP.NET Core and templates. And even though we got it working, they're very popular, it was still always very hard for us to grok the 10 tool chains required to actually make the end-to-end work. And actually, throughout ASP.NET Core, we have shipped deprecated tool chains in the box because during the time frame of developing the product, Gulp was gone, and so was Bower, and then was Webpack, and we were basically fighting an infinitely changing tool chain. And we all knew it was painful, but we all kind of didn't have a good solution. And I recall Steve and Dan Roth looking really hard to try and figure out how to get C# in the browser again. And Dan was actually looking at script and basically everything we built in the last 20 years of the history of trying to run C# in the browser to understand what it took to get back there. And I think once Steve showed Blazor, Dan was like, oh my gosh, we have a new path to actually helping our customers be productive again, because you really do spend a ton of time with the tool chain to even integrate like React or Angular or Vue with the .NET backend. And it was kind of painful, even though people kind of like make it work. It is very painful, and Blazor kind of makes that go away again, I think.
Yeah, Steve, it's pretty obvious that you took all the lessons learned from Knockout, and then, of course, your experience in using your own tool, Knockout, to build out the Azure portal. There must have been things going through your mind like, oh, this could be done better. Oh why am I having to do this again? Like I can sort of feel that. Is that what happened?
Yeah, it does sometimes feel like life is on a loop where we keep reinventing solutions to the same problems over and over, but hopefully we do it slightly better each time.
Yeah, well, it's pretty obvious just because of how clean and elegant and beautiful, and I'll use that word over and over again, how beautiful the component model is. Just dealing with binding to events and binding in general. I mean, all the things that took so much ceremony in other platforms have just been so simplified. And I'm trying to find situations where I would need any more than what you have offered, and I'm hard-pressed to find those situations.
Cool.
So great job. Let's just take a minute or so to give some props to the other team members who've contributed and maybe talk about their contributions. I think that's appropriate.
I think that sounds great. And I'm super paranoid that I'm going to miss someone out here, but I'll try. David can help you. And if I miss someone, it's David's fault. So obviously, David obviously was been involved from the beginning in like making this actually a thing. And I remember that David and Stephen Halter made the first debugging mechanism.
Debugging, oh man. Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah. That was amazing low-level hackery to get a debugger working on this runtime that had debugging. So that was a big thing. Dan Roth, that David mentioned, is the product's PM, and he's kind of been the driving force behind making everyone believe that there's a product to build here, and especially convincing management through a trillion meetings. Ryan Nowak has been a really big influence on Blazor. He was responsible for basically everything in the Razor compiler toolchain, everything that to do with how that stuff works. He's also had a big influence on the component model and all the developer-facing APIs. He's very good at API design. Javier, that David also mentioned, is a general kind of web and security expert who's built large parts of Blazor. We've also got Pranav on our team, who's another general purpose .NET expert. Particularly built a lot of the build toolchain, like all of the MS build stuff and the way that we integrate with SDKs and things like that. He's done a lot of that stuff. Who else? We've got RJ and Taylor, who've both done a lot of work on Razor, the tooling stuff. Taylor created the VS Code experience in the first place, not the whole of VS Code, but the Razor inside VS Code stuff. Our dev manager, Artak, he's kind of kept the project on track with processing all the GitHub issues and scheduling everyone's work and so on. We've got some newer team members as well. We've got Safia, who just joined about a month ago. She's been incredibly productive. Before she even joined the team, she already started sending pull requests to Blazor. She just figures anything out and does it, which is amazing. Then we've got Leah, who's our current intern, who's figuring out how to make the getting started experience really good. Who have I missed, David? Anyone?
The whole team working on Mono to make Blazor actually a thing. Running .NET Core in the browser is a huge deal.
Yeah. In 800K. What?
Yeah.
800K CLR. What are you guys doing?
Yeah. So especially Larry. There's a lot of people on the Mono team doing that, but Larry's kind of he keeps everything together, figures out the little details about why the debugger's not working in a certain way. And yeah, he's invaluable. And yeah, there are others too.
Wow. Thank you guys for taking time out of your busy days. And Steve, thank you. And David, sorry for interrupting your family time. It was, it was kind of cool to watch. It's great to see the toys in the background and the kids. It's great. Thank you guys both. It's been very great to have
Thank you.
Well, that was a hoot. Whoa, whoa. In the next episode of Blazor Train, we'll take a look at the anatomy of a Blazor project. I'll go over every aspect of every file in every folder to make you a more informed and therefore more productive Blazor developer. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blazor Train!